Welcome, everybody, to the Culture of Life podcast. My name is Andrew Jacoby, and I am super excited to be joined today by Dr. Richardson Dilworth, who is the head of the Department of Politics at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Thank you so much, Professor, for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
I'm super excited to talk to you. Actually, I was listening to one of your interviews today with a gentleman in New Jersey.
You mean from the Jersey City
yes, I did.
Free Library?
I listened to that interview with you today. It was very interesting about the different sort of the development of various cities, and so so I wanted to start with you because it's not a subject I talk a lot about, but it's something that is interesting to me because I lived in Europe. I lived in Spain and then in Vienna, Austria for a number of years. And I was struck by the difference in the way that the cities are created in Europe in my travels around Europe. And I forget if it was Winston Churchill, who I knew said, I think he said, we make our buildings and thereafter they make us. So there's something there. And he also, I believe it was also him who he said that America doesn't have cities. It has conglomerations of buildings. And so I'm kind of curious what the way that we create our cities in the United States, in your view, what does it say about us as a country, as a people, as a civilization?
As compared to Europe.
Or it doesn't, you don't have to go there, but take it any way you want to take it. We can bring back Europe later, but however you want to take that question.
Well, I'll just make a few points of I think the basic comparison between European cities and urban areas and American cities and urban areas. The thing that you often say is that Europe and the European system of governance was built around cities. That is, if you ever read Max Weber's book, The City, he makes this argument about the emergence of modern European society coming out of the establishment of city-states from what he called the fusion of market and fortress. And that was sort of this positive feedback loop between the fortress, the sort of seat of sovereign power, and the tribute, the fact that it was also a gathering place where people brought, I think, oftentimes surplus, not money per se, but surplus from what were otherwise subsistence farmers to within the walls of the fortress. And marketplaces develop from not just giving that surplus, from trading that surplus, and from that then you get specific market occupations, brokerage functions, the development of more advanced monetary systems, adjudication, jobs around adjudication.
Disputes come up.
Yeah, right. And from that, eventually it expands past the walls of the fortress to create the walled city, the classic European walled city. And then trade links between those city-states lead to specialization, lead to further development, and eventually the city-states sort of evolve into the nation-states. The result of that, and it's not consciously city design. I mean, some aspect of it is conscious city design, but another aspect of it is evolution, social and institutional and organizational and physical evolution. Physical in the sense of the physical structure of a city,
sure,
not the physique of humans. So in Europe, the major cities are often in fact, virtually always the seats of government power, the capitals. And in a lot of instances, the city itself was also the sort of the originating place and the incubator for a sense of national identity. The idea that being French emerges in Paris, and it takes a long time for the outlying provinces to understand that they're actually French and not Breton or something like that. in the United States, which of course is obviously colonized much later, the typical story is that our national capital was very consciously not placed in a city. Of course, it was in a city. It was in New York. It was in Philadelphia, but eventually it was, it was settled in these marshlands around the Potomac, and obviously a city was constructed around it. But it wasn't a city when it was first settled, and it was first chosen as the capital, and sort of and consciously. And that's typically a way of saying that we were a fundamentally anti-urban nation in a lot of respects. And certainly
the Great Compromise, the sort of Senate versus the House kind of thing as well, where you don't want these large conglomerations of people to rule the larger agrarian parts as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Senate representation and electoral college, the structure of the electoral college, are to a certain extent designed to not give advantage to dense populations. Right. Although, it's very hard, even if you read the Constitutional Convention debates and stuff like that, it's very hard to figure out what those folks who are putting that system together really thought about in terms of cities. There's virtually nothing in the Constitutional Convention debates about cities, because the cities weren't that big, and the country was overwhelmingly rural. There was some discussion on the part of James Madison in the Constitutional Convention debates that he understood the kind of explosive population growth that the country was going to experience.
Right.
It had already experienced explosive population growth. He had some sense of that level of population growth, but he was talking about it mostly in terms of drawing congressional House districts, not in terms of cities. Virtually the only thing that's said about cities, and I think it was Elbridge Gerry, but I'd have to go check again, was that at the Constitutional Convention debates, one of the only statements about cities was essentially that I think it was Gerry said he understood it to be the general sense of the country that the capital should not be located in any big commercial city. And of course, there's all these comments going through most of the famous writers about American society and politics, from Thomas Jefferson to Tocqueville to James Bryce, that they saw the emergent large cities in the country as a real threat to what America was. So there's this strong...
Too cosmopolitan.
Honestly, I think it wasn't cosmopolitan. I think it was that it certainly was a level of xenophobia, especially on the part of Bryce, in sort of understanding that these are cities. And Bryce is writing in the 1880s, so it's much later. But Bryce is talking about, what one element is Bryce sees this sort of wave of quite poor immigrants.
That's what my family came
coming to cities. Yeah, I mean that's it, right. That's because there were a lot of them.
Sorry.
He basically saw them as essentially ignorant, easily manipulated by the political parties, the source of crime and stuff like that. And the other thing is, I think cities were pretty horrible places in the 19th century. There's no reason to think that they weren't. They were the center for disease epidemics.
Sanitation, yeah.
Yeah, they burned down, not infrequently. If you were looking for the moral collapse of society, the level of visible prostitution in cities is going to be much more. And then also, even things like the emergence of the medical profession, which really emerges in the larger cities, is highly suspect in the 19th century. It's
because they're bleeding you.
They're bleeding. Well, and also the suspicion.
Putting leeches on you.
Yeah, it was seen as a bohemian profession of sort of weirdos, and suspected of digging up corpses from cemeteries. So
to do experiments.
Yeah. Right. So anyway, how does that relate to sort of how we build cities in the United States? Once again, I think it's largely evolutionary, haphazard, and only consciously designed in a sort of post hoc way. The earliest exception to that, I'd say there are two early exceptions to that. The two early exceptions are, first of all, the prevalence of street grids. And, even, Descartes has this thing about street grids where he sees street grids as this amazing innovation in Europe. And of course, even some of the earlier cities like Philadelphia and Charleston have, Savannah, Charleston and Savannah have street grids.
Beautiful cities, Charleston and Savannah.
Oh yeah, they're all
two of my favorite places, and they're amazing cities.
Yeah,
or little towns, or whatever you would call
them. The older the city gets, the more beautiful it is. That's pretty much it. But the other element of sort of conscious city design, to a certain extent, is the boosterism, especially the boosterism as you move further west, where you have people building towns, not cities, but building towns to a certain extent with the conscious hope of attracting the railroad, and sort of basically being speculative investors, like but trying to promote this town as the next big thing because they own all the property in it.
Right.
If they can get a railroad to come through it, then it'll increase in land value. And that's a level of conscious design and an effort. Of course, most of them fail, but a lot of those western cities were sort of booster affairs, oftentimes built on smaller settlements or on the basis of smaller settlements. And of course, then the cities were not like they were in Europe as the sort of originators of modern government power, because modern government power had already been invented in Europe. At least that a Western notion of modern government power had already been invented. And so I think, they were far more just sort of commercial areas, and therefore developed somewhat haphazardly based on, not haphazardly in the sense that they were always on major transportation routes, originally river routes, but the specific location could be, could kind of be random around that basic trade port. So there's an historian whose name I now forget, who wrote a great book about New Orleans called The Accidental City. He's one of the, I think, best known historians about New Orleans. He teaches at Tulane. I wish I could remember his name. But he, he makes this really strong point in this history of early New Orleans that New Orleans could have been anywhere along that sort of mouth of the Mississippi, because it was all bad land for building a city. But, its final location is pretty arbitrary. And it's sort of the old question that I think Jane Jacobs actually raises in the Economy of Cities, is that why did one part of the mouth of the Hudson River become New York City, and the other part became the little cities in Hudson County, Jersey City, Bayonne, Hoboken, none of which are of any great sort of importer status, especially when she was writing.
Unless it's Newark, where I think like immigrants or people that are new or tourists get off and they think they're in New York City, and then there's all these places.
I've done that.
People do that. There's like businesses that are trying to take advantage of this particular mistake that people make. I'm in New York. No, not really. You're in Newark.
It becomes pretty clear pretty fast that you're not in.
Well, you might, but if you're close enough to the exit, you might be able to make a buck. But anyway,
but anyway, so I don't. And then of course there becomes then you get conscious city design, and of course you get conscious city design early on. Obviously in Philadelphia, William Penn and his surveyor have this idea for what they call a green country town, and it's relatively specific in terms of how they expect the plots to develop along the grid that they lay out between the Delaware and the Schuylkill. and New York City has a successive number of grids. Ultimately, I think it's the 1811 grid that sort of stretches all the way up to all the way through Manhattan. Obviously, Brooklyn has several sort of oddly interlaced grids that mean you always get lost. And those are all sort of, those are grids being, to a certain extent, they're anticipating development. To another extent, they're being retrofitted onto existing development. Their entire purpose is to maximize property value. To a certain extent, you can say there's a Republican ideology behind it in the sense that it was creating equality, because it would be very hard to have a large estate in a set of grids. It was also to maximize street frontage and to maximize ease of transportation for the purposes of selling property and maximizing that value, property value, and also, of course, to rationalize water and sewer systems and transportation systems. Obviously, I think I already said that. One other interesting element I think about city design in the United States, and it gets back to the idea of social contract that you were mentioning before we started talking on microphones, and the sort of American founding period and the role of cities in that early founding period, is that James Madison, when he's one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, writes this famous Federalist paper, Federalist Number 10, which is on the dangers or mischiefs of factions. And he says, factions are one of the great threats to a republic. And it's basically a number of people who get together around some common goal or common purpose, typically around money or value of some property of some kind. And they organize to work for their own self-interest against the interest of the common good. And you don't want them overtaking an assembly or a legislature or whatever, because they're only working for themselves. And it sort of can be seen as prescient. It's not written in such a way that he's specifically indicting political parties. Political parties look very different to him than they would look to us. It does seem kind of prescient of political machines in some respects. But one interesting element of it is that, he's identifying as well in the idea of factions. He's identifying a sort of problem within social contract theory. And of course, social contract theory is a major ideological inspiration for the Declaration of Independence, for the state constitutions, for a lot of the state colonial charters, and obviously for the United States Constitution. And the idea of factions, of course, one of the fundamental sort of elements of social contract theory is that, as you said, you have isolated individuals in a state of nature who come together out of individual self-interest in order to create a sovereign power or a commonwealth. And therefore the ideal system under social contract is basically an unfettered relationship between radically isolated individuals and some sort of sovereign power, whether it's limited sovereignty or the absolute sovereignty of Hobbes and so on. But what do you do if you have these intermediary associations that are larger than individuals, but they don't have the legitimacy of the state? Those are the factions that Madison's talking about. He says the real problem here are these sort of intermediary associations that can command more power than any of the individuals, that's their actual purpose, is to sort of develop an unfair advantage from these isolated individuals, but to do so without the assent of the state, so that there's a level of illegitimacy or corruption. And, of course, one of the interesting elements of the U.S. Constitution as a social contract is that it actually embeds intermediary associations in one respect by constitutionally recognizing the states and creating a compound republic as a federal system. And Madison thinks that that's great. He actually sees that as a means of preventing the mischiefs of faction. But another element of the Constitution is that cities are nowhere mentioned in the Constitution. Certainly cities existed. They already had charters. Several of them already had legal charters. but they were not seen as part of the formal governmental system. They're not discussed really in the Constitutional Convention debates, and they don't find their way into the Constitution, with of course the one exception that the Constitution defines the District of Columbia. But it's not defining it as a city. It's a district for the federal government.
It's like the Vatican.
Yeah, right. There's a sort of a strong argument, I think, to be made, and it's mostly made by the legal scholar Jerry Frug from Harvard Law School and others, that the problem of the city as a legal concept is that it is this kind of intermediary association that can't be boiled down to the individuals that compose cities, but it's never a fully legitimate government in the eyes of in the eyes of the Constitution, in the eyes of American law, and so it sort of holds some sort of weird position where it's floating around from being a sort of private corporation to a government. It's always sort of in between that area and that identity.
So interesting. The wanted to go into this social contract and this what we were talking about before we began, but I wanted to ask you one thing, if you would notice the difference, because one thing I noticed in Europe was that smaller towns and even some of the bigger cities are built around churches as the center, it seems like. So, in Vienna, you would say Stephan's, in Stephan's Platz, the main center, is a huge church. Seville in Spain, the Catedral de Sevilla is this massive, and that's also in the smaller towns. So that's the center, and then the town is built out around the church, and that might say something about the philosophy or the theology of the people that built those places. And I'm not sure, was that abandoned in the United States? This haphazard kind of development, was that, or was it? Because obviously the United States was a religious country. Maybe it was the difference between the Protestants and the Catholics, whereas for the Protestants, the actual church itself wasn't the biggest thing. It was kind of a more individual, hey, me and the Bible kind of thing, as opposed to the institutional church, which is the Catholic Church, which would be in Europe more prevalent. Do you have any thoughts on that before we get into the sort of social contract, and are we seeing it unravel, or have we gone astray?
Yeah, well, obviously in Europe, there's a much greater ease and comfort based around tradition of a governance role for a church and the idea of a state religion, and that was obviously reasonably consciously rejected through the First Amendment in the United States. So, churches play a very different governance role in the United States. They don't really play a formal governance role, obviously, by virtue of the First Amendment, one would hope. And in part, that's based around, of course, the religious pluralism that defined a lot of the colonies and had to be accommodated in the Constitution. So they were never going to be really playing that sort of the same role that they played. That I think is probably one of the reasons that they're often located in the center of a European town. If we go and if we want to talk about social contract theory, if you look at the famous frontispiece of Hobbes's The Original Leviathan, that has that man composed of many little men overseeing a walled city, and if you look down that frontispiece, on the left-hand side of the piece are the tools of government power, and on the right-hand side are the tools of ecclesiastical power. So, I mean, in that, he was making a theory where he was explicitly joining religion and government. Mm. And half of Hobbes is a theological... not Hobbes. Half of Leviathan is a theological argument that pretty much gets ignored these days.
What would be how would you lay out that theological argument that he's trying to make?
Oh, I haven't read it, and so
Okay,
I'm
so
not gonna.
okay,
I'm not
got
gonna. I'm not even gonna try. But
it wasn't a pop quiz.
Yeah, I know. But it's there.
Well, because the government becomes kind of a sovereign god in a certain way. You have to sort of there's a level of obeisance to the state that would make it kind of a god, I guess. But I'm guessing too. I haven't read it in a long time.
Well, he's pretty clear in the first half of Leviathan that it's the social contract that creates civilization. That civilization is based on that social contract, not just government. I would just say one thing about the First Amendment and its prohibition on the establishment of a state religion, which is that the meaning of that is, of course, like most things in the Constitution, actually reasonably vague. And especially at the state and town level, and especially in New England.
Yeah, because there's a lot. All the different states had different churches, right?
Yeah.
So you had like constitutions in the state, and that was what I understood was their ability, the attempt to not have a national church, which would get in the way of the state churches. So that was my understanding of what the prohibition was. It wasn't, hey, there will be no religious element in governance. It will be, hey, the Washington's not going to create the church so that Massachusetts can and Philadelphia can. So if you want to be Quakers in Philadelphia and you want to be Puritans in Massachusetts, go ahead.
I think it was even a little bit more divided than that, and I think it varied by colony to colony and state to state. So the Quakers, it's inherent in that Quaker in a Quaker, I don't know, ideology. Pluralism is kind of baked in. Acceptance of difference and pluralism,
or lack
is
of hierarchy,
kind of lack
right.
of hierarchy.
I went to Quaker school. We could tell our teachers their first name.
Where'd you go to Quaker school?
Penn Charter.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I guess
OPC
this isn't
91,
part of
the last all boys class.
That's
since 1689.
Well,
unfortunately,
I lived from about 1982 and 1986 to 1989 in Alden Park.
Okay.
I grew up, and the Cambridge is the big red building right across the street from Penn Charter.
It's a beautiful area.
Yeah,
I really like
really
that
nice.
area. Okay, so so let's get into this social contract.
One thing I wanted to say about the First Amendment is, even in New England, I think in a lot of places in New England, it wasn't necessarily a specific church. It was that the towns got to choose the church, but that there had to be a town church, and you were taxed to pay for the town church.
Right.
And it was local, so it was in a lot of respects a local function. Not really an urban function, because in part those towns were designed to be non-urban in a lot of respects.
Interesting. Because they were grouped by people who went from a particular church to a particular place to form a town, you would assume.
Yeah,
Something
and
like
they were
that.
Also to a certain extent designed to be small scale. They were surrounded by
It's like all the
farms.
Amish go out to to Lancaster and say, okay, this is our town. We're going to do our Amish thing here. And,
yeah.
Okay. So the social contract thing, we talked about it before, and I bring this up in a lot of episodes, especially anytime I get on the mic with somebody who has a political, philosophical, political expertise. I always ask this because it's kind of very fascinating to me because, we live in a very different country than we did when I grew up in 1985, and it seems like a much more violent country in a certain way. Maybe this is just, we see more of it through the lens of social media, whereas before when I grew up there was ABC, NBC, and CBS, so you had a very, filtered view of the news that we don't have that today. But anyway, it just seems to be a lot of confusion, a lot of division, and there's two major kind of stories of what's happening, and I wanted to get your opinion of what you think of these. There's some people are saying that the foundations of the country, of the United States, the greatest country that ever existed. This is a wonderful place. We sort of went off the rails somewhere. We abandoned the founders' institutions. We maybe create, like Christopher Caldwell talks about this, where he says we created through the civil rights sort of architecture, we created almost a third constitution because we had to take away the free association clause and sort of bring in a ton of adjudicating who can, if we want to have a club, it's got to have the right racial mixture or what have you. So there was this commerce clause kind of problem where you're now all of a sudden the administrative state metastasized, then you get this fourth branch of government that the founders never really intended, right? So that's the one sort of argument. Like everything was good, we sort of went off the rails. Maybe it's the progressives in the 20s, they didn't like democracy really, they wanted to rule by expertise, rule by experts, Woodrow Wilson, this kind of thing. That's one side. The other side would be what we were talking about earlier with Patrick Deneen, another guy at Harvard, Adrian Vermeule in the law school there as well. This is more like sort of the Catholic, I would say the Catholic post-liberal, which is the critique is that no, there's a deeper problem with the Enlightenment social contract theories that we were talking about, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and the more modern view of like Rawls, things like this. And what that is that the prior view of the human person is that the human person is by nature social. So you speak language because you're a social animal, according to Aristotle. So you're not an individual. You're individual, yes, but you're in a context automatically, and that context is impossible to really abstract you out of. I can't be behind the Rawlsian veil of ignorance. It's impossible, actually. And so the philosophical exercise is a mess. And when you build a society on a mess of a metaphysical view of, let's say, an anthropological view of the human person, you get this mess of, you have people on the right that think that prey to this market forces, and anything that the market wants has to be good, right? And so you have this distortion here, and on the left you have this. We want to reach this. We need to have massive government intervention in order for everybody to experience freedom, because we all start out at different places, so we have to sort of use the government to homogenize us so that we can achieve the liberty that we're promised by the country. And so we're seeing the playing out of this radical individualist view, which is I need to be sovereign as an individual. And what that necessarily involves is the destruction of all institutions in my way. So that would be institutions of family, of religion, of any kind of civic third way, like what de Tocqueville was talking about, these little associations. All of that has to be sort of removed, and you end up with this kind of huge state and individuals, because the state is necessary, that apparatus is necessary in order to protect us from each other, because we're just these individual choosers, taking our, what John Stuart Mill might call our experiments in living. We're all just experimenters in living, and because we have unlimited desires, we're running up against each other. And there needs to be this kind of totalitarian move by the government to protect us from one another. And so there's an insanity, and it's a natural insanity based upon the philosophical moves that we're making, which are too individualistic. So there's a confused question, but I'm wondering, I think kind of where I was going, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about either side of this debate.
So I would sort of dumb it down to maybe sort of two basic critiques. One is a critique sort of in favor of social contract theory as a basis for a political system, and another one is then a critique of social contract theory as the basis for a political system. And so the first one is as I learned it, the sort of the communitarian critique of the radical individualism or isolated individualism of social contract theory. And that's coming from, really sort of the this intellectual movement from the 1980s and the 1990s. And I personally think what that is a response to the phenomenon that Robert Putnam identified in Bowling Alone as that sort of a lot of the sort of collapse of civil society. And sort of informal socializing and stuff like that. And one response was, I think, among political philosophers and philosophers in general, to begin to theorize community. The other critique is the critique that sort of social contract, that a government premised on social contract theory sort of ends in the 1960s and 1970s, because we moved to group rights and we move to group identity.
Interesting.
That's the civil rights revolution. I would say, first of all, I am generally biased in favor of saying that I wouldn't give too much weight to political theories to sort of as causal factors in however anybody thinks, in terms of how anyone experiences their quality of life in a deeper sense than I think that word's typically used. But I also would, I think, premise this also in terms of talking about this in relation specifically to cities. So you've got a really, I think, important intellectual thread that runs from the Depression to the to I think really kind of the end of the 20th century, and that is to a certain extent I think some element of the Chicago schools picking up the traditional anti-urbanism, the traditional American anti-urbanism, and the touchstone article is Lewis Worth's Urbanism as a Way of Life, where he compared, he wasn't the only one who did this, but he compared urban life to folk life and sort of said, in folk society, individuals are understood as their whole self because they're in small scale communities where everyone understands them as an individual. No matter what role they're playing, they're that same individual. Whereas in urban society, because of the scale of urban society, people are only known as their outward roles because they're not, because of the level.
Nobody knows them as a person.
Yeah, they're the level of anonymity, and as a result, they develop more superficial personalities. And Worth went so far as to claim that can create a kind of schizophrenia that leads to mental illness. One might just guess that it was possibly the crushing depression that was creating some problems rather than urbanism. He published that article in 1938, and there's a clear tie-in with fascism as well in terms of the ability for demagogues to control a mass society of sort of isolated.
Right, Hannah Arendt
urban.
talks about this a lot. There's a precursor to totalitarian is individual, isolated people.
Yes, yeah. So you see that, but then, the real significant move comes with Jane Jacobs and The Death of Life of Great American Cities, where she says it's precisely that anonymity that actually creates a meaningful urban community, where it's eyes on the street. It's the fact that you have repeated interactions with people in your neighborhood who you don't otherwise know.
Right.
Like, we're neighbors. We socialize to a certain degree. We watch each other's back. We create a system of protection. We're always out on the street, so there's this system of safety among strangers and among a lot of strangers. And it's meaningful community, even as we don't know each other deep down. We don't want to know each other deep down. Maybe I could depend in a relatively anonymous civil society on the good graces of somebody who's otherwise a serial killer, but I'll never know because I don't need them in that respect. Serial killer is a bad example, but the idea is that this is a form of meaningful community that's also able to accommodate diversity and difference in a way that a small scale community isn't going to be able to.
Right, so we can do more of our experiments of living because nobody's in our business,
yes,
essentially. But we're safe, so it provides this kind of middle ground.
Yes.
We provided enough safety by these little, let's say, tacit agreements amongst neighbors to take care of each other, but not too close.
Yes.
So that we can still, again, back to Mill, we can still experience our experiments in living and try whatever kind of lifestyle that we want to live.
Yeah.
And that's the idea.
Yeah.
So do you have a thought in terms of the critique from let's say the Patrick Deneen kind of liberalism itself is will produce tyrannical societies because of the individual, because of the focus on the individual as the primary unit of the polis, as opposed to, let's say, the family, which is everybody's born into some kind of family, and the health of and you can't really have a healthy society without healthy families, because it's a natural institution that we're all brought into the world into. And sort of, if you don't have that as your focus, then you're lost. And you can't, it doesn't make sense. It's insane, essentially.
Yeah, well,
you'll end up insane.
That's a rendition of a Worthian argument.
Mm.
If we took that argument and turned it to a sort of how it applies to urbanization, that would be this Worthian argument of alienation.
Same thing.
Because of individualism. I mean, maybe not exactly the same thing, but pretty close. And Jacobs is providing that sort of communitarian response to that, which is the same thing in a lot of respects. To a certain extent, if you're saying that the antidote to mass society and the alienation of mass society, and now, of course, that's what you're saying is not a critique of mass society. What you're saying is it's a critique of a society premised around the idea that societies are composed of isolated individuals who have
it's
no
a critique
ties
of,
other
of
to
social
themselves.
contract theory as it was born in Enlightenment liberalism, essentially.
Yeah, but the Worthian argument is sort of the same thing in the sense that it imagines that urbanization creates a mass society where everyone is essentially an empty vessel in relation to each other.
Right.
So the only thing that is left is you as a radically isolated, alienated individual.
Right.
Which in his model creates mental problems, which creates. And in some respects, it's the same thing. Jacob's antidote is this sort of communitarian response to sort of say, this is in fact, this is meaningful community.
There's some third way.
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be. There's a middle. There's like a golden mean, to use an Aristotelian term. There's a golden mean between the two.
And she doesn't take the route of going back to sort of a folk society answer, which would be the family, the church.
Right. So your point would be,
like
her point would be that that toothpaste is out of the tube. We can't go back there because we've already progressed beyond there in a certain way. We've created these big cities and we're going to live in them. So how do we live in them in the best way, the most human way possible? And we have to create some kind of hybrid where you're not in my business, you're not telling me how to live my life, but at the same time we're protecting each other because we have a shared interest in our communal safety.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. That's not really the argument she makes. I mean, her argument is based far more around design features, and it's a critique of Ebenezer Howard and this stuff. But political theorists who later rely on Jacobs, and in particular communitarian political theorists who later rely on Jacobs, are making the kind of argument that you're suggesting. So, probably the most popular communitarian writer of that period from the 1980s to the sort of early 21st century, Benjamin Barber, in his primary communitarian text, Strong Democracy, he's constantly struggling back and forth with this sort of how do you create a sense of strong community, in this heavy critique of liberalism. How do you make this strong community without reverting to some form of sort of tyranny of the majority or sort of authoritarianism or something like that?
Right, and that's his answer.
Well, his answer is you find some middle ground. We have to create strong community, but also we recognize people are individuals. And that's really that same sort of calculus that Jacob's using, and he relies explicitly on Jacobs. The interesting thing about that book, and one important element that moves the dialogue forward, I think, in some respects, is at the end of the book, it's when he's making these policy recommendations that he relies on Jane Jacobs to a certain extent. And he also goes to try and make some argument about how at a large scale, in order to create a more meaningful sort of strong communitarian-based democracy, we should make more use of cable television. Right?
Interesting.
Yeah, and of course he's writing at a period when cable television is doing nothing like building community. But it's the closed caption sort of idea that you could talk to people from different places, and this could be a form of connectivity. So he's imagining a sort of decentralized cable system. Of course, he's writing
Sounds like the internet. Yeah.
The internet, but he's sort of beginning to sketch out kind of the internet.
How that would work. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
But interestingly, of course, I think one of the major critiques of the internet is precisely Worth's critique, is that the internet creates anonymity,
right,
and it creates alienation, and it creates
insanity,
and it leads to mental illness, and it's very much that sort of mass society figure of urbanism, no longer connected to urbanism.
To a real place. It's
Yeah.
all this kind of Gnostic move away from the material into the spirit, which all just consciousnesses sort of flaming each other on Twitter or whatever.
Right.
There's actually an interesting, we're sensitive of the time. Thank you so much you've been super generous with your time. But I want to end with maybe perhaps we can talk about this because it's a little bit bigger than a quick answer. So part of the critique, the post-liberal critique coming from Vermeule and Deneen and these guys, is that basically part and parcel of the Enlightenment project is a rejection of the church hierarchy, right? Because it comes from the Reformation, which was an interiorization. Hey, we're going to reject this authority of the church. Now we have the Bible. We can just read it ourselves. I don't need some guy with a funny hat in Rome to tell me what to do, right? I got the Bible, me and the Bible, we're good to go. And that you then take away the Bible, and now that's what the Enlightenment was. Okay, we don't even need that. We have reason. We have, the French Revolution. We have our own reason in order to guide our lives. So what their point is that, and Tom Holland is an English historian, in his book Dominion talks about this. He says it's really hard to get to the universal value of the human person, which is relied upon by the Declaration of Independence, the sort of natural rights argument of like, hey, these are certain rights that are ordained essentially by nature and nature's God, to use the language, and they're pre-governmental. That the government is here to secure these rights, and they were taken away from us before, so now we're going to assert them in our revolution. And by the way, if this government starts to take them away, you should change it again. And so the point is that there's critique is that that's all the seed corn of this philosophical movement is essentially Christian. Christianity, especially the church, takes the three feed stores of Judaism and then Christianity, right? Then you have Greco-Roman, and it's sort of filtered through Christianity, and then we get these societies that we've created in the West, because it used to be Christendom before it was Europe, and then Europe became the United States. We sort of exported it and created this new version of it, right? Let's say the Protestant version of Europe in a certain way. But the point is that now they're saying that what you're seeing now is a kind of, that seed corn has been chewed up. We've used it up. We're now abandoning it and saying like, okay, we don't need that kind of morality. I think you were talking about this a little bit with this urban piece of like, hey, I don't want you looking at my life and making any judgments about how I'm living it. Just you protect me, I'll protect you physically. And that's about all we can share with one another as it relates to our shared life together. And that's the whole that's the essence, the best that we can do for the common good. So they're saying that, okay, so now that we've burnt through the seed corn, what are we going to do? What's next? What do we go back to it? Do we try to recover a sort of metaphysical kind of reconstitution of our understanding of our lives and of a societal, a new great awakening? Or do we become Buddhists? Like, what do we do here now that we're going into this sort of brave new world where we've clearly mostly are in the process of or have abandoned this, let's say, philosophical and theological underpinnings of our freedoms in our society?
I don't know the arguments that you're talking about very well, and I have not read a lot of the folks that you're talking about. So to a certain extent, I'm going on
what I'm saying,
what you're saying,
sure.
Right? But one critique I would make of that is I'm interested in the work that the metaphor burning the seed corn is doing here, because I would want to think more about that idea of exhausting some sort of finite resource of morality so that we have sort of somehow run out of morality. And I don't know that that's really a sort of an accurate. I would have questions about whether or not that's really how humans create moral systems, and create and sustain and apply and implement moral systems. I mean, I see lots and lots and lots of moralizing happening all the time, and it's typically coming from some system of core beliefs that person has sort of attempted to think through and stuff like that. So I would wonder about that to a certain extent.
Sure.
The other thing I think is, well, it's hard. I'm wondering how I can apply this in terms of thinking about cities and city building.
Sure.
I sort of see a lot of, well, okay, I'm gonna use this as an excuse to talk about something that I think is interesting, and it's sort of related to what we were talking about before. If you look at that period where people claim that we moved out of the social contract, where a lot of, I think, especially conservatives would say that there was this sort of like fragmentation of morality and stuff like that. You're talking about the 60s and the 70s.
That was a big movement, the 60s, sure.
Yeah. And, the other thing that you saw during that period was a deep concern about cults. And especially religious cults.
Sure.
All these books coming from coming from larger Christian churches, talking about how you can identify a cult, and sort of people are calling themselves Christians, but actually they're these like weirdo cults and stuff
the
like
Waco
that.
people or whatever.
Yeah. One fascinating thing to me is that in this digital age, we now have a resurgence of people talking about cults. In fact. I think that is, that's one of the sort of modal things that people use to, in some respect, cast aspersions on different groups and organizations.
Sure.
To say that they're very cult-like in a lot of respects.
Sure.
And this is certainly not an original point of my own, but I have no doubt lots of cults are super bad, and I wouldn't have wanted to have I wouldn't want to have had any of my family's members be Jim Jones or Heaven's Gate or something like that. But at the same time, the organizational dynamics that define a cult are pretty clearly sort of baked into human society in some respects, and they obviously. A dysfunctional cult that does something bad is in some respects just a sort of a pathological example of something that's relatively common within human society, and it's often premised around some sort of fundamental moral claim. And obviously, it might be using something like the Bible or whatever. And I'm just going to tell you something I'm obsessed with in terms of thinking about cities and stuff like that. When we think of cults that sort of define the 1990s, especially, we think of Waco. Yep. We might think of Ruby Ridge. We think of typically we might think of like white nationalist things up in Oregon.
Or what have you.
Yeah, they tend to be highly rural. They tend to be deeply separatist, and they tend to have lots of firearms. And that pretty much is the Branch Davidians, in a nutshell. But of course, that also was a sex cult.
Mm-hmm. Mostly the cults turn into that at some point, right?
That seems to be a major motivating factor, yeah. the thing I've always wanted to do is compare Move in Philadelphia.
Oh, right. The West Philly group.
Yeah, to which was a cult. I don't. There's no getting around it. People on the left, I think, sometimes get angry if you call them a cult, but they're a cult.
Yeah,
I don't know what else to say.
Yeah.
And to compare them to Waco, because in a lot of respects, the stories and the role that those two organizations play now in popular political culture are sort of fascinating mirror images to one another, in my view.
Interesting.
And that is, if we take the basic storyline of Waco, it's a cult formed around a charismatic leader and settled kind of in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, David Koresh. It forms around David Koresh, and it goes to the middle of nowhere, where they're doing their thing, and they're stockpiling lots of arms, and that catches the interest of federal law enforcement, and then federal law enforcement oversteps itself, and you have a tragedy. Move is formed not at the same time, but roughly sort of maybe the same time. It's definitely earlier. And it's in that period of the sort of 1970s cult thing. It's very much sort of back to nature organization. It has a charismatic leader, but a very different kind of charismatic leader in, I guess, John Africa. And it similarly, right? But of course, it didn't go off by itself. I mean, one of the major problems was that it was a sort of nuisance neighbor. So it draws the attention of the police because people are complaining about living next to Move. And the police, the first time, oddly enough, under Rizzo, the police don't totally overstep themselves. And in fact, it's a police officer who's killed, but that means they can bring every Move member up for up on a murder charge. But then when they move into further in West Philly, it's kind of the same, and at roughly the same time, although earlier, but in the 80s, as Waco. It's the same dynamic. You've got this cult around a charismatic leader. They're stockpiling arms at that point, and the primarily local law enforcement oversteps itself, and that leads to tragedy.
Right.
The thing that then makes them interesting, I think, to a great extent, is that Waco then becomes this major call to arms for these sort of fringe right. I mean, it's that sort of is the thing that kicks off Alex Jones's career.
Right.
And it takes on this sort of mythical role in terms of talking about tyrannical government action, in terms of talking about the limitations on freedom of speech, and right to bear arms, and all of this stuff. The Move. The Move tragedy turns into a sort of touchstone on the to a certain extent fringe left, where it's also connected to Mumia Abu Jamal.
Right. Yeah. So that's free Mumia. Right.
And it focuses around police abuse. It focuses around racial discrimination.
Right. Sure.
So it figures into this left narrative. I think the thing I find fascinating about this is that to a certain extent, the cults don't become interesting. I mean, and also they're both fundamentally weird. They're both fundamentally these groups of people who just started acting really pathologically by the norms of standard society.
Yes.
And they're very odd in terms of things that people talk about that are somehow examples of some larger thing. Like if I wanted to say anything about police abuse or race or racism or colonization, why would I go to a tiny little back to nature cult in West Philadelphia? There's so many better examples. If I wanted federal overreach, why would I look at federal overreach and gun control? Why would I look at Waco?
Right.
Of the millions of things I could look at. But these two things have become sort of touchstones in popular political culture that serve much larger functions than themselves. That they define two different moral narratives about government overreach, about government tyranny, and about I think the nature of human freedom.
Sure.
I find them pretty interesting, and it's also a very interesting city-country kind of
parallel.
There's
two different. There are one's in West Philly and one's out in the sticks. So, do you not, or what is your thought on the critique that we've lost? Like, for example, John Adams has his famous quote about how the country was built for the Constitution was built for a moral people, moral and religious people, and if not, we're going to go through its bonds like a whale through a net or something like that. So clearly there was a certain faction within the founding fathers who even understood this. Was the debate, like, is it going to be a commercial nation, or is it going to, is this sort of a shining city on a hill?
Mm-hmm.
So do you have thoughts on whether that's, or what kind of, where we are with that, and what's kind of how do we navigate that? Because if we're moving beyond a kind of shared morality, and we're going into this maybe environment where we're going to try to privatize this, are we lost then? I mean, what are we supposed to do? I'm just trying to get a sense of like, where do we go from here?
Your view of humans is far more noble than my view of humans.
I don't know about that.
I put a far less of an emphasis on the role of ideas and the role of morality in human evolution and social evolution.
Interesting.
I think that we are far more shaped by our surroundings and far more shaped by the context we find ourselves in. Even when those contexts and surroundings are built by us, we still don't have control over them, and they shape our behavior. I think that what ideas are sort of the genetic equivalent of random mutations. That the thing that's great about ideas is that they're cheap and they're constantly proliferating out of human brains. And, every once in a while, one finds some useful niche by which it can begin to alter a conversation. And the niches change primarily by the forms of mass communication we have and the evolution of mass communication.
Got it.
I think morality is a natural occurring a natural occurring element within human society that humans will create. And I think the ability of humans to agree on common moral ground by which they can begin to do things like build legal systems and such as that is defined far more. The potential for that is defined far more by the contexts in which they find themselves than.
So you're bottom up. You want to build the cities the right way in such that if we build the context where we live as people, as animals, how we live together, then that will sort of form us.
Yeah,
in a certain
and that's
way.
to a great extent Jacob's argument. I would far more sort of say at this day and age that we need to think of the city as a legacy form of mass communication. That is, the city is a technology of mass communication that makes other forms of mass communication possible, like the daily news press and stuff like that, that ultimately is eclipsed by broadcast technology
The internet.
and then digital technology.
God help us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, on that note, Professor, thank you so much for your time. We could go on for a long time, but I think that's an interesting place for us to end the conversation, whereas I was sort of coming at it from a top down. So these ideas are creating certain problems or certain scenarios in the world, and you're sort of looking at it from a, well, what about the buildings? Like, the idea is okay, but like we're more affected by how we build and how we live together in a physical way.
Yeah.
And I think that's really an interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, and I think that's really interesting.
Oh, great. Well, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really
Thank you.
appreciate your time. Thank you, and I've really been really learned a lot from it.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, let's see. Okay.